The weight of the badge. The morning air was crisp as Officer Emily Carter stepped out of the police precinct and into the quiet streets of Lakewood, a suburban town where she had spent the last 5 years enforcing the law. The rising sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and Emily took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of her badge against her chest. It was a symbol of her authority, her duty, and the order she had sworn to uphold. She slid into her patrol car, mentally running through the checklist she had internalized over the years. Radio check, patrol area briefing, readiness for anything. She prided herself on being meticulous, believing that rules were meant to be followed, that the law was black and white, and that maintaining order required vigilance. As she drove through the neighborhood, she spotted a group of teenagers hanging out near the entrance of a gas station. Their laughter rang out in the cool morning air, but Emily's jaw tightened. To her, it looked like loitering. Slowing the patrol car, she rolled down her window. "Move along," she called out, her tone firm but detached. The teens exchanged glances, a mix of annoyance and amusement flickering across their faces. "We're just waiting for a friend," one of them, a boy in a red hoodie, muttered. Emily tapped the side of her patrol car, her gaze unwavering. "Waiting or not, you can't block the entrance." With reluctant sighs, they shuffled away, some shaking their heads, others muttering under their breath. Emily felt a flicker of satisfaction. Rules were rules, after all. She continued her patrol, eyes sharp, hands steady. At a crosswalk, she caught sight of an elderly woman struggling with her grocery bags. For a brief moment, she considered stopping to help, but then dismissed the thought. That wasn't her job. Instead, she focused on the road, her attention shifting to a car parked awkwardly over a faded yellow line. A minor violation, but a violation nonetheless. Parking slightly crooked today might lead to something bigger tomorrow. That's how disorder started, with small infractions that grew into larger ones. Emily pulled out her ticket book, wrote up a citation, and placed it under the car's windshield wiper. Another problem solved. A community of broken rules. By lunchtime, Emily had already issued 3 tickets and given out numerous warnings. She was tired but righteous. The world operated best when people followed the rules, and when they didn't, it was up to her to correct them. Yet, as she pulled into a diner for her lunch break, a fleeting doubt crept into her mind. As she caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror, she didn't just see a dedicated officer. She saw something else, a rigidity in her expression, a hardness in her eyes, a woman so focused on discipline that she hadn't stopped to consider whether she was truly helping anyone. She pushed the thought away. Emily entered the diner, greeted by the comforting aroma of coffee and grilled sandwiches. Taking a seat in a corner booth, she flipped through her case notes, mentally preparing for the rest of her shift. That was when she overheard a quiet conversation from a nearby table. "It's like they don't trust us," a man was saying, his voice tinged with frustration. "Every time I go into a store, I get followed. Every time my daughter walks home from school, people stare at her like she doesn't belong." Emily didn't look up, but she felt her pulse quicken. It wasn't the first time she had heard grumbling about law enforcement. People didn't always understand that policing required decisiveness, a quick assessment of right and wrong, order and disorder. Still, the man's words lingered in her mind as she finished her meal. An encounter that changes everything. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emily's shift neared its end. Just one last stop, the grocery store. The store was busier than usual, filled with people rushing to complete their evening shopping. Emily walked through the aisles, grabbing the essentials she needed for the week. Milk, bread, coffee. Always coffee. As she turned down the cereal aisle, she noticed a young girl standing near the shelves, looking lost and uncertain. Emily's trained eye immediately locked onto her behavior. The girl, no older than 16, was black, her dark curly hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She held a box of cereal in her hands, staring at it intensely before putting it back. Then she reached for another box, examined it, and placed it back too. Her hands trembled slightly. Emily's instincts flared to life. She had seen this kind of behavior before. Suspicious. The way the girl's eyes darted around. The way she moved from shelf to shelf, picking up items and returning them. Was she looking for security cameras? Planning to shoplift? A possible suspect? Emily felt the old certainty rise in her chest. Order had to be maintained, and she was just the person to do it. Her grip on her grocery basket tightened as she discreetly observed the girl's movements. The girl, Leila, picked up a can of soup this time, clutching it tightly, as if grounding herself. Then she turned her head slightly, eyes flickering toward the entrance. Was she waiting for someone? A lookout? Emily didn't hesitate. She had seen enough. Setting her groceries aside, she strode forward, her authoritative presence cutting through the noise of the grocery store. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice sharp and unmistakably commanding. Leila jumped, startled, nearly dropping the can of soup. Her eyes widened in fear as she turned to face Emily. "What exactly are you doing here?" Emily asked, her tone controlled but firm. Leila froze. Her hands shook even more now. She looked around, as if searching for an escape, before forcing out a weak reply. I'm just waiting for my dad." Emily's gaze hardened. "Where is he?" Leila swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's talking to the store manager. I was just looking around." Emily studied the girl carefully, doubt and suspicion warring in her mind. Something about her nervousness felt rehearsed, like someone caught in a lie. "That's not a very convincing story," Emily said, taking a step closer. "Why don't you tell me what you're really up to?" The air in the store seemed to shift. A few customers had started watching the exchange, their gazes curious but wary. Leila looked around desperately, her breathing growing rapid. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm telling the truth. I just got confused. The store is so big." Emily's patience was wearing thin. She had been in law enforcement too long to fall for excuses. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," she said firmly, reaching for Leila's arm. Leila flinched as if burned. Her eyes were wide, her entire body radiating fear. And then, before Emily could react, Leila called out, her voice rising in desperation. "Dad, please, where are you?" The entire store fell silent. A deep, authoritative voice suddenly rang out from across the store, one that made Emily's blood run cold. "Officer, I'd like to know why you're harassing my daughter." Emily turned slowly. A tall, well-dressed man stood near the entrance, his expression unreadable. And when Emily recognized him, her entire world tilted on its axis. Because she knew exactly who he was. And it changed everything. The unraveling truth. The grocery store fell into a heavy silence. Every pair of eyes turned toward the entrance, where a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp navy suit stood with an air of authority. His deep voice carried across the store like a thunderclap, and there was something about him, his presence, the way he held himself, that made people instinctively straighten their postures. Officer Emily Carter's heart dropped. She recognized him immediately, and the realization made her stomach twist. Samuel Richards, a former district attorney, a prominent businessman, and a man with serious influence in this town, and more importantly, Leila's father. Emily felt a strange, sinking sensation. She had made a mistake, a big one. Mr. Richards strode forward, his eyes fixed on Emily, though his hand immediately went to his daughter's shoulder, grounding her. Leila gripped onto him like a lifeline, her small frame trembling as she pressed into his side. Emily had spent her career priding herself on being able to read people. Right now she could see that Leila was scared, terrified, even. And not because she had done something wrong, but because she had been accused of something she didn't do. A wave of discomfort rippled through Emily, but she shoved it down. She was just doing her job. "Officer," Mr. Richards said, his voice clipped but controlled. I'd like to know what exactly my daughter has done to warrant this level of scrutiny. Emily straightened her posture and squared her shoulders, pushing through the sudden unease. She was behaving suspiciously, she said evenly. She was wandering the store for an extended period of time, picking up items and putting them back, looking around as if she was checking for security cameras. In my experience, those behaviors often indicate shoplifting. Mr. Richards cut her off, his voice dangerously calm. You believe my daughter was stealing? Emily hesitated. Yes, that's what she had assumed. But something about saying it out loud, with him staring at her with that unreadable expression, made it sound wrong. Leela let out a shaky breath, and Emily watched as silent tears slipped down her cheeks. I wasn't stealing, Leela whispered. I just got lost. Mr. Richards tensed. His grip on his daughter's shoulder tightened slightly in reassurance. Emily wanted to dismiss that excuse, but something about the way Lila's fingers gripped her father's coat, as if she was clinging onto the one safe thing in the world, made Emily's doubt creep back in. The customers around them had stopped pretending to shop. They were listening now, watching, waiting. You said she was wandering. Mr. Richards pressed. You mean she was walking through a store, where people are supposed to walk? Emily didn't like his tone. She was acting nervous, she countered. Her body language. My daughter has social anxiety, Officer Carter. Emily froze. The certainty she had felt just moments ago wavered. She gets overwhelmed in unfamiliar places, Mr. Richards continued, his voice measured but firm. Bright lights, large crowds, and excessive noise cause her to shut down. When she's in a stressful situation, she fidgets. She picks things up. She puts them back. She looks around, not because she's planning to steal, but because she's trying to ground herself. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. She had been wrong. Leela hadn't been stealing. She had been panicking. Mr. Richards didn't raise his voice, but his presence alone made Emily feel like a rookie officer being scolded by a commanding officer. You made an assumption about my daughter based on your perception of suspicious behavior, Mr. Richards continued, his voice dangerously quiet. But tell me, Officer Carter, if my daughter were a young white girl instead, would you have seen her behavior the same way? The question hit Emily like a hammer. Her throat went dry. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Had she? Would she have? Her mind raced, searching for a defense, an explanation, something. But the truth stared her in the face. She hadn't just assumed Layla was stealing. She had already decided it before even confronting her. The mirror of truth. The tension in the air was suffocating. A store employee cleared his throat awkwardly. Is everything okay here? Mr. Richards turned slightly, his jaw tight. Everything is fine, Tom. Just clearing up a misunderstanding. Emily caught the way his voice tightened around the word misunderstanding. For the first time in a long time, Emily Carter, the officer who prided herself on being right, felt completely, devastatingly wrong. She had humiliated a young girl in front of an entire store. She had made her feel like a criminal. And now, standing in front of her father, a man who had fought against racial bias in the courtroom for years, she realized she had become part of the problem. Emily took a deep breath, forcing her emotions down. She had to fix this. Her voice caught. She swallowed hard. I made a mistake. The admission felt like swallowing glass. Leela wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, still clutching her father's coat. I shouldn't have assumed, Emily said, her voice quieter now. I should have asked you if you needed help first, instead of. She exhaled sharply. Instead of treating you like a suspect. The store was silent. Mr. Richards held her gaze for a long moment, then turned to his daughter. Leela, do you want to leave? Leela hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Mr. Richards gave a single, curt nod to Emily before guiding his daughter toward the exit. Emily watched them go, a feeling of shame and regret curling inside her chest like smoke. It wasn't the first time she had made an arrest. It wasn't even the first time she had stopped someone based on suspicion alone. But it was the first time she had truly questioned whether she had been fair. She turned, catching the gazes of the onlookers who had witnessed the whole thing. Some shook their heads. Some whispered. Others just looked at her, measured her. And for the first time in her career, Emily wondered if she was actually the problem. The cracks in her foundation. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in years, she questioned herself. Had she been doing this all along? Had she been looking for problems where there weren't any? Had she been seeing people not as individuals, but as potential threats? She picked up her phone and hesitated. Then, almost mechanically, she typed in a search. Implicit bias in policing. The articles that popped up were uncomfortable to read. Her chest tightened. She had spent years believing she was just doing her job. But tonight, she felt something shift. Because tonight, for the first time, Emily Carter saw the possibility that she had been wrong. And that terrified her more than anything. The awakening. A restless night. Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Leela's face. Her wide, fearful eyes. The way her hands trembled as she clutched that can of soup. She hadn't been afraid of getting caught. She had been afraid of Emily. And then there was Mr. Richards' voice, calm but cutting, each word sinking into Emily like a blade. If my daughter were a young white girl instead, would you have seen her behavior the same way? The question haunted her. She had spent years training herself to see potential threats. But now, for the first time, she wondered how many of those threats had been real. Her badge, her pride, felt heavier than usual. At 2:37 a.m., she finally gave up on sleep. She got up, pulled on her sweatpants, and settled at her kitchen table, her laptop screen glowing in the darkness. She hesitated before typing, feeling an unfamiliar weight in her fingers. Implicit bias in policing. She stared at the search results. A list of articles, research papers, and studies filled her screen. Headlines that she would have ignored before now seemed to burn into her mind. The impact of racial profiling on minority communities. Implicit bias. How it shapes law enforcement decisions. Why unconscious bias is hard to detect. And even harder to fix. Her throat tightened. She clicked the first link. Uncomfortable truths. The article was long, dense with statistics, studies, and testimonies. Emily forced herself to read every word. She learned that people, even trained officers, were more likely to perceive black individuals as threats, even when they posed none. She read studies where police officers were shown images of unarmed black and white men and asked to react quickly. They were more likely to see a weapon when the person was black, even if there was none. Her chest tightened. Had she done the same thing? Had she seen guilt where there was only fear? Another study caught her eye. Minority youth report significantly higher levels of anxiety and stress when interacting with law enforcement, regardless of guilt or innocence. Emily swallowed hard, remembering the way Lila had flinched when she reached for her. That wasn't guilt. That was fear, and Emily had put it there. Her hands clenched into fists. She thought about her training at the academy, how they drilled into them the importance of being aware, of spotting suspicious behavior. But had anyone ever taught her to question her own perception of suspicious? Had anyone ever told her that she might be wrong? The realization made her stomach twist. She had thought she was one of the good ones. But what if, without realizing it, she had been part of the problem all along? Breaking the silence. At 4:15 a.m., she finally closed her laptop. She felt exhausted, but it wasn't the kind of tiredness that sleep could fix. It was the exhaustion of realizing that everything you believed about yourself might not be true. Emily stared at her phone for a long moment, her thumb hovering over a name in her contact list. Sergeant Davis. She wasn't sure what she was going to say only that she couldn't stay silent anymore. With a deep breath, she pressed call. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Carter. The surgeon's voice was laced with sleep and confusion. It's 4 in the morning. This better be important. Emily hesitated. Then her voice came out quieter than she expected. I think I made a mistake. That got his attention. What kind of mistake? Emily took a deep breath. I need to talk to you. Today. A pause. Then. Come in at 8. Click. Emily exhaled, pressing the phone against her forehead. Her shift didn't start until noon. But today, her job wasn't about policing. It was about facing herself. The confession. By the time Emily arrived at the station, the coffee machine was still warming up, and most of her colleagues were just rolling in. But Sergeant Davis was already in his office, waiting for her. Emily hesitated at the door, then knocked. Come in. She stepped inside. The sergeant leaned back in his chair, giving her a sharp, assessing look. You never call me at 4 in the morning, he said. What's going on? Emily sat down, clasping her hands in her lap. Her heart pounded. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she told him everything. She told him about Leila, about Mr. Richards, about the way the whole store had gone silent, about the question that had burned into her brain. If she had been a white girl, would I have reacted the same way? Davis didn't interrupt. He let her talk, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he sighed. I won't lie to you, Carter. That's not an easy thing to admit. Emily swallowed. I know. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. So what do you want to do about it? Emily had spent the whole morning thinking about that question. She wasn't sure she had the perfect answer. But she knew one thing. I want to be better, she said quietly. And I want to help the department be better too. Davis studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. There's a workshop next week. Bias training. I was going to make it optional. His eyes met hers. But maybe it shouldn't be. Emily blinked. Are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time we all take a long, hard look in the mirror. Something inside Emily unclenched. For the first time since that night in the grocery store, she felt like she was taking a step forward instead of standing still. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. A new mission. That afternoon, Emily did something she never thought she would do. She drove back to the Richards house. Her hands were clammy as she stood at the front door. She wasn't sure if they'd even let her in. But she had to try. With a deep breath, she knocked. Footsteps. Then, the door swung open. Mr. Richards stood there, his expression unreadable. Emily swallowed hard. She hesitated, then forced herself to say the words that mattered. I was wrong, and I need to make it right. Mr. Richards studied her. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Come in. Emily exhaled and stepped inside. This was only the beginning. But for the first time, she was finally ready to listen. The conversation that changed everything. A heavy door opens. Emily Carter never hesitated. She had chased suspects down alleys, faced aggressive criminals, and stood firm in tense situations, all without a second thought. But now, standing in front of Samuel Richards' house, waiting for the door to open wider, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Nervousness. This wasn't just another conversation. This was her reckoning. Mr. Richards stepped aside, his sharp, assessing gaze never leaving her face. Emily hesitated for half a second, then stepped inside. The house was warm, inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, tension-filled moment they had shared at the grocery store. A framed family photo sat on a nearby table. Emily recognized Leila immediately. She looked happier in the picture, her arms wrapped around both of her parents, her smile wide. Not the frightened, trembling girl Emily had falsely accused just days ago. Emily forced herself to look away. "Have a seat," Mr. Richards said, motioning to the living room. Emily hesitated, then sank onto the couch. Samuel Richards sat across from her, his hands clasped in front of him. His posture was calm, but not relaxed. He was still measuring her, waiting. Emily took a slow breath. "I need to start by saying I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. Mr. Richards didn't move. "You already said that at the store." Emily nodded. "I know, but saying sorry once doesn't undo the damage I did." She exhaled. "I need to do more than apologize. I need to understand." Mr. Richards raised an eyebrow. "Understand what, exactly?" Emily met his gaze. "What it's like for Leila. What it's like for you. Because I think I've been blind to something important, and I don't want to be anymore." For the first time, Mr. Richards' expression shifted, just slightly. A glimmer of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then he leaned back in his chair. "You really want to know?" Emily nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's talk." A lifetime of fear in small moments. Mr. Richards took a deep breath before speaking. "You think what happened at the store was the first time Leila's been treated that way?" he asked. Emily swallowed hard. "No." Mr. Richards gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Good, because it wasn't. Not even close." He leaned forward. "Do you know what it's like to teach your child, from the time they're old enough to understand, how to survive an encounter with the police?" Emily felt her stomach twist. "She was 7, he continued, when I had to sit her down and explain that if she ever got stopped, she needed to keep her hands where people could see them, to never make sudden movements, to say yes, sir, or yes, mom, no matter how unfair it felt." Emily felt like she'd been punched in the chest. She was 10 when a teacher accused her of cheating because her test scores were too high. Emily's hands tightened into fists. She was 13 when a security guard at the mall followed her through every store, just waiting for her to steal something. She was there to buy a birthday gift for her mother. Emily closed her eyes for half a second. Then finally, Mr. Richards said what had been burning in her mind since the grocery store. "You're not the first police officer to make my daughter feel like a criminal before she ever did anything wrong, Officer Carter." Emily looked down at her hands. They felt heavier than usual. For years, she had believed she was doing her job the right way, that her instincts were always right. But now she saw it. She saw the patterns. She saw that her actions weren't isolated. She had been part of something much bigger than herself. And she hated it. "I need to be better," she said quietly. Mr. Richards studied her. "Why?" Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head. "Why do you want to be better?" "Because you got caught. Because you feel guilty." Emily inhaled sharply. "No," she said honestly. "Because I should have been better all along." The doorway of change. Silence settled between them. Then Mr. Richards sighed and leaned back. "You say you want to understand," he said. "Then prove it." Emily frowned slightly. "How?" Mr. Richards tapped his fingers against the armrest. "There's a community meeting tomorrow. It's about racial bias and law enforcement." He leveled her with a steady gaze. "Come." Emily hesitated. She knew those kinds of meetings. She also knew that police officers weren't exactly welcome. Mr. Richards must have seen the doubt flicker across her face because he leaned forward slightly. "Don't just say you want to change," he said. "Show it." Emily clenched her jaw, then nodded. "I'll be there." For the first time since she had walked into the house, Mr. Richards looked slightly impressed. "Good," he said. "Let's see what you're really made of, Officer Carter." Facing the fire. The next evening, Emily stood outside Lakewood Community Hall, her stomach tight with nerves. She had faced down armed suspects, but this was somehow more terrifying. She took a breath and stepped inside. Immediately, she felt the weight of every stare. People recognized her. Some whispered. Some just watched, expressionless, but waiting. Emily forced herself to hold her ground. She wasn't here to be comfortable. She was here to learn. She spotted Mr. Richards and Leela near the front of the room. Leela's expression was tense, but curious. Emily nodded to her, then took a seat in the back. The meeting began. One by one, people stood up and shared their stories. Stories of being stopped for no reason. Stories of their children being followed in stores. Stories of being treated like criminals before they even opened their mouths. Emily sat through all of it. She listened, really listened. And for the first time, she didn't try to defend herself. She didn't try to explain it away. She just absorbed it. By the time the meeting ended, she felt exhausted. But she also felt determined. She approached Mr. Richards and Leela. "I still have a long way to go," she admitted, "but I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Mr. Richards studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, for the first time, he nodded. "Then keep showing up." Emily smiled just a little. "I will." Because for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she needed to be. And this time, she was finally listening. The hardest lesson. Sitting in the fire. Emily sat in the back of the community hall, her hands resting on her lap, her pulse steady but uneasy. She had never felt like an outsider before. Not in a town she had sworn to serve. Not in a place where she had spent years enforcing the law. But tonight, she felt like she didn't belong. Not because of hostility. No one had spoken to her yet, but because she was here to listen, not lead. She wasn't in uniform. Tonight, she wasn't Officer Carter, the enforcer. She was Emily Carter, the student. At the front of the room, a young black man in a blue hoodie stood up. His name was Dion Williams, and his expression was tired, but not from lack of sleep. From years of the same story. "When I was 16, he began, his voice level but firm. "I was walking home from a football game when a cop pulled up next to me and asked what I was doing." Emily's stomach tightened. The question was so normal to her. But she could hear, even in his voice, that it meant something entirely different to him. "I told him I was just walking home. But he didn't believe me," Dion said, shaking his head. "He made me empty my pockets, put my hands behind my head, right there, on the sidewalk, like I was a damn criminal." A few murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Emily shifted slightly in her chair. "I kept saying I hadn't done anything," Dion continued. "But he didn't care. It wasn't about what I did. It was about what he thought I might do." Emily inhaled deeply. She thought about Leela. She thought about herself. She thought about all the times she had seen behavior, not people. And suddenly, she felt something sink deep into her chest. She had never stopped a kid like Dion before. But she could have. She knew it. And she had never thought about it this way before. Layla speaks. The next person to stand up nearly knocked the air out of Emily's lungs. It was Leela. She was still small, still soft-spoken. But tonight, there was something different about her. She wasn't shaking. She stood firm, even if her voice was gentle. "I don't like going out much," she admitted, her fingers gripping the side of her shirt. "It's not because I don't want to. It's because people make me feel like I don't belong." Emily clenched her hands together. "The grocery store that day." Leela exhaled. "That wasn't the first time I was followed in a store. It was just the first time someone actually stopped me." Emily felt like the smallest person in the room. "I don't know what I did to make people scared of me," Leela continued, her voice quiet but stronger now. "But I wish I didn't have to prove I wasn't a bad person before people saw me as a good one." A few people nodded. Others sighed. Mr. Richards sat nearby, watching his daughter with something close to pride. But Emily, she felt wrecked. Because she was part of the reason Leela had that fear. It wasn't just society. It wasn't just the system. It was her. The person who had pushed her too far that day in the store. Emily didn't even realize she was gripping her own arms until the speeches ended. When the meeting ended, people started to stand, stretch, and talk amongst themselves. Some hugged. Some shook hands. Some just sat in silence, processing everything. Emily stood, her heart racing. She didn't know if she should leave, or if she should try to talk to Leela. But before she could decide, Leela turned, and their eyes met. The air felt thick. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. She saw so many emotions in Leela's face. Fear, sadness, exhaustion. But there was something else too. Something Emily didn't expect. Leela wasn't just looking at her with anger. She was waiting. She wanted to see what Emily would do. Emily inhaled sharply, and then, slowly, she walked toward her. The conversation that changed everything. Emily didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, she felt like words weren't enough. So when she stopped in front of Leela, she did something she had never done before. She asked instead of assumed, "Can I talk to you?" Leela hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. They stepped a few feet away from the others, near a set of chairs by the wall. Emily took a breath. "I know I can't change what I did at the store," she said, careful to keep her voice steady. Leela said nothing. So Emily continued, "But I need you to know that I've been thinking about it, and I've been thinking about you, and I know now that I didn't see you that day." Leela's brow furrowed. Emily swallowed. "I saw something that wasn't real. I saw a problem that didn't exist. I saw guilt when there was only fear." Leela's fingers tightened around the fabric of her sweater. Emily exhaled. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I needed you to hear me say it. I was wrong." For a long moment, Leela said nothing. Then, slowly, she let out a breath. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. "I was scared." Emily felt something deep in her chest break. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm sorry." Another silence. Then, Leila did something Emily didn't expect. She tilted her head slightly and asked, "Why are you here?" Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" Leila hesitated. Then, finally, she looked Emily in the eyes. "I mean, why are you trying to fix this?" Emily felt her own breath shake. Because it was the right thing. Because she wanted redemption. Because guilt had eaten her alive since that night. But none of those answers were enough. So she gave the only one that mattered. "Because I don't want to be that kind of officer," Emily admitted, her voice raw, real. "And I don't want anyone else to go through what you did." Leela studied her. Then, after what felt like forever, she gave a small nod. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly. Emily met her gaze. "I do." And she meant it with everything in her. A new beginning. By the time Emily left the community center, she felt different. She wasn't fixed. She wasn't forgiven. But she had taken one step forward. And now, she had a choice. Go back to who she had been. Or keep walking toward the person she wanted to become. She already knew the answer. As she got into her car, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then she typed, "Seat, Davis. I need to talk. About the department. About training. About everything." And then she hit send. Emily Carter had spent years thinking she was enforcing the law. Now she was learning how to serve the people. And for the first time, that felt like the real job. The choice to change. A new mission. Emily Carter sat in her patrol car the next morning, but everything felt different. For years, she had believed policing was about control, keeping order, enforcing the law, making sure people followed the rules. But now she wondered if she had missed the point entirely. The night before, she had stood in a room full of people who didn't trust her. And for the first time, she didn't resent it. She understood it. Because how many times had she walked into a situation with her mind already made up? How many times had she seen a suspect instead of a person? She gripped the steering wheel, staring at the sun rising over Lakewood. Something had shifted inside her, and there was no going back. Her phone buzzed. "Sergeant Davis, my office. Now." Emily inhaled sharply. It was time. The talk that could change everything. When Emily walked into Sergeant Davis' office, he was already seated behind his desk, arms crossed. He didn't say anything at first, just studied her, waiting. Emily cleared her throat. "I need to talk to you about our training." Davis raised an eyebrow. "Our training?" Emily nodded, steady. "It's not enough." A long silence stretched between them. Davis leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "You've been in the field 5 years, Carter," he said, "and you're just now realizing that." Emily clenched her jaw. "No," she admitted. "I think I've known for a while. I just didn't want to see it." That made Davis pause. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calmer when he spoke next. "What changed?" Emily thought of Leela's wide, terrified eyes, of Mr. Richards' quiet disappointment, of Dean's story at the community meeting, of the countless times she had assumed the worst before even asking a question. She took a deep breath. "I made a mistake," she admitted, "and I can't keep pretending I didn't." Davis watched her carefully. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "What do you want to do about it?" Planting the seed. Emily took a deep breath, then laid it all out. "We need real bias training. Not just once a year. And not just a 2-hour slideshow where everyone zones out. We need real conversations. Officers need to know how their actions impact the community. We need to start listening." Davis sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know how hard that's going to be," he muttered. Emily didn't flinch. "I don't care." Davis let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. Then he sighed. "I've been in this department 22 years, he said. "I've seen officers come and go. I've seen change happen, and I've seen it get shut down just as fast." He met her eyes. "You're asking for something that's gonna ruffle feathers." Emily swallowed. "I know." Davis studied her again. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "All right, Carter," he said. "Let's start making calls. Not everyone wants change." The pushback came fast. Some officers were on board. Others? Not so much. Emily had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected it from her closest colleagues. Officer Jake Morrison, one of the first people she trained with at the academy, rolled his eyes when he heard about the meetings. "Come on, Carter," he scoffed. "Now you're one of those people." Emily frowned. "One of what people?" Morrison snorted. "You know, the ones who think we're the bad guys, that we have to tiptoe around criminals because we might offend them." Emily inhaled sharply. "This isn't about tiptoeing," she said, her voice firm. "It's about seeing people before assuming the worst." Morrison crossed his arms. "Look, I get it," he said. "You made a bad call with that girl. But that doesn't mean we all have to change the way we do things." Emily clenched her fists. This was exactly the problem. "Morrison," she said, her voice calm but firm, "what if it had been your daughter?" That shut him up. His jaw tightened. Emily took a step forward. "I don't think we're bad guys," she continued, "but I think we can do better. And if you don't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem." Morrison's expression darkened, but Emily didn't back down. She had spent years being afraid to ask questions. Not anymore. Building bridges, not barriers. The first training session took place in the same community center where Emily had once felt like an outsider. Now, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Mr. Richards was there. Layla was there. And to Emily's surprise, so was Morrison. He sat in the back, arms crossed. Unhappy, but present. It was a start. Emily stood at the front of the room, nervous but determined. "This is going to be hard," she admitted. "We're going to have uncomfortable conversations. We're going to challenge the way we think." She took a deep breath. "But if we want to do this job the right way, We have to be willing to change." A murmur spread through the room. Some officers nodded. Others shifted in their seats, skeptical. But no one left. And that was enough for now. A quiet moment of forgiveness. After the session ended, Emily was packing up when she felt someone approach. She turned and found herself face to face with Leela. Emily straightened. Leela looked different, not completely at ease, but stronger, more confident than the scared girl Emily had seen in the grocery store. "I heard what you said up there," Leela murmured. Emily exhaled. "Did it help?" Leela hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. "A little." Emily let out a small breath of relief. "I know I can't undo what I did," she admitted, "but I'm going to keep trying." Leela studied her. Then, for the first time, she smiled. Not a big one, not a full one, but enough. "I believe you," she said softly. Emily felt something deep inside her loosen. Not because she had been forgiven, but because she had earned trust. And in this moment, that was worth more than anything. The road ahead. Change wouldn't happen overnight. Emily knew that. But as she walked out of the community center, feeling the weight of the night settle around her, she also knew this was only the beginning. Because she wasn't just trying to be a better officer. She was trying to be a better person. And that was the most important work of all. A new legacy. The echo of change. Emily Carter had always believed policing was about rules. She had spent 5 years enforcing the law, ensuring people followed the right paths, believing that control was the key to safety. But now she realized policing wasn't just about rules. It was about people. And people were complicated. Some nights she still lay awake, thinking about Leela's wide, fearful eyes at the grocery store, thinking about Mr. Richards' disappointment, thinking about Dean's story at the community meeting, thinking about how many times she had gotten it wrong. She couldn't change the past, but she could change everything going forward. And that was exactly what she planned to do. The test of real growth. A week after the first bias training session, Emily was back on patrol. This time, she wasn't looking for problems. She was paying attention. She was listening. And then, it happened. A call came in over the radio. Suspicious individual loitering near Greenfield Market. Black male, hoodie, acting nervous, requesting backup. Emily's stomach tightened. That was the exact description she would have responded to without question a month ago. Before Leela. Before Mr. Richards. Before everything. She clicked the radio. "I'm nearby. I'll check it out." When she pulled up to the market, she spotted the young man immediately. Tall, skinny, maybe 17, 18 years old. He was pacing near the store entrance, hands in his hoodie pockets, head down. Old Emily would have seen danger. Would have thought, he's looking for a way to steal something. Would have walked in with authority, demanding answers. But not today. Emily stepped out of her patrol car, but didn't reach for her belt. Didn't put a hand on her holster. Didn't try to control the situation. Instead, she walked toward him and said, "Hey, you okay?" The young man stiffened. His eyes flicked up. And in that split second, she saw it. Not guilt. Not anger. Fear. The same fear Leela had. Emily softened her voice. "I'm not here to give you trouble," she said gently. "I just want to make sure you're all right." The young man hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just waiting for my mom. She ran inside. And I don't like crowds." Emily let that sink in. She nodded, offering a small smile. "That's all right," she said. "I don't like crowds much either." His shoulders relaxed slightly. Emily didn't ask for his ID. Didn't pat him down. Didn't treat him like a criminal for standing outside a store. She just stood with him. A few minutes later, a woman hurried out of the store, a shopping bag in hand. "Marcus," Sorry I took so long." The boy, Marcus, exhaled in relief. His mother froze when she saw Emily standing next to her son. Her eyes widened, because she knew what it looked like. She probably thought Emily had already accused him. Emily took a step back, giving the mother space. "I was just making sure Marcus was okay," she said gently. Marcus' mom looked stunned. Then, slowly, she exhaled. She turned to her son. "You good baby?" Marcus nodded. She turned back to Emily, still uncertain. Emily nodded. "Have a good night, Mom." Then she walked away. Not because she was done with them, but because they had never been a problem in the first place. A shift in the department. The next morning, Emily sat across from Sergeant Davis again. "Something happened last night," she said. Davis raised an eyebrow. Emily told him about Marcus, about how she had handled the situation differently than before, about how she had seen fear instead of guilt. Davis nodded slowly. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward. "You know," he said, "when I started in this department, I thought I knew everything. I thought the law was the law, and that was that." Emily frowned. "I spent years writing tickets, making arrests, following the book," Davis continued. "And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people." Emily inhaled sharply. She knew exactly what he meant. "But you," Davis said, "you're seeing now." Emily swallowed. "It's not enough." "No," Davis agreed, "but it's a damn good start." A beat of silence. Then, Davis picked up the phone. "Captain Reynolds," he said when the line picked up, "I want to expand our community training program, and I want Officer Carter to help lead it." Emily's eyes widened. She hadn't expected that. Not at all. But as Davis hung up, he gave her a knowing look. "This is bigger than just you, Carter," he said. Emily nodded, because she finally understood that. One last conversation. That evening, Emily stood in front of the Richards house again. She had no badge, no uniform. Just herself. The door opened. Mr. Richards raised an eyebrow. "I wanted to thank you," Emily said. Mr. Richards crossed his arms. "For what?" "For calling me out," Emily said honestly. "For forcing me to see what I didn't want to see." Mr. Richards studied her. Then, to her surprise, he smiled slightly. "I don't care about apologies, Officer Carter," he said. Emily nodded. "I know." Then she hesitated. "But I want you to know," she continued, "I'm trying to make sure no one else makes the same mistake I did, not in this town." Mr. Richards was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Emily blinked. Then, carefully, deliberately, she shook it. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a step forward. And for now, that was enough. The new Emily Carter. Over the next few months, things changed. The department introduced mandatory bias training. Emily helped organize town halls where police and the community could talk, really talk. She mentored younger officers, teaching them to pause before they assumed. And slowly, Lakewood changed, too. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But little by little. And for the first time in her entire career, Emily Carter knew she was doing the right thing. Not because she had a badge. Not because she had authority. But because she had finally learned how to serve. And that was what really mattered.